Folks, welcome to episode number 1 of the new show, The Social Exchange. I'm pleased to welcome our first guest on the show, Dr. Michael Shermer. Dr. Shermer is a social psychologist, a teacher, founder of the Skeptic Society, editor-in-chief of Skeptic Magazine, and author of 19 books that I know of. His most recent publication is the one out on shelves today, January 9th. It's called Heavens on Earth, The Scientific Search for the Afterlife, Immortality, and Utopia. Michael, thanks for talking with me again.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Well, we're going to talk about your brand new book, Heavens on Earth. And before we get to my own reactions and questions about it, not that people don't know at this point, but will you tell listeners about who you are and your work and just a potted summary of the new book and your goals in writing it?
Oh, sure. Yes. Well, my day job is publishing Skeptic Magazine and running the Skeptic Society, which is a 501c3 nonprofit science education organization. And then I also write a monthly column for Scientific American called, appropriately enough, Skeptic. I've been doing that for, 205 consecutive months, going to April 2001. My goal is to make it to 300 at least. That'll take me to March of 2025 if I make it.
You got it.
And then I'm also a professor at Chapman University. I teach a class called Skepticism 101, How to Think Like a Scientist. And then, of course, I write my book. So that pretty much sort of summarizes what I do with most of my time when I'm not riding my bike and hanging out with my buddies and family. The book, it's kind of like all my books. They're pretty much an extension of previous books or ideas that I've been working on or thinking about, such as, why people believe we're things. So if, the sequel to that was Why People Believe in God. Actually, the title was How We Believe, but that's what it was about, science and religion. And then if I'm skeptical of weird things and God, what about morality? So I wrote Science of Good and Evil. And then the sequel to that was The Moral Arc, which is my last book about moral progress and how we can ground morals in science and reason. And so really, I've never tackled the afterlife in an in-depth way. And that's kind of the next natural subject for atheists, skeptics, humanists, whatever, to deal with. If we don't believe in God and the paranormal and the supernatural and we're materialists and taking a scientific perspective, what about the afterlife? How do you know there's not, an afterlife and so on? So that's what this book is about. Although the religious versions are kind of low-hanging fruit, pretty easy pickings for any scientist to dismantle. They're really grounded in their local geographical cultural beliefs over the millennia. So really the core of the book, I deal with that, of course, but the core of the book is scientific attempts to achieve immortality. That is radical life extension, the cryonics people, transhumanists, the extropians, they're against entropy.
Yeah, I didn't understand that.
I mean, it's sort of a weird thing, but, it's, in a way, that's what we're all doing. That's what being alive is all about, is pushing back against entropy. Well, this is a group that wants to do it indefinitely. And if none of those work, then there's always uploading your mind into the cloud or into a computer, the singularity people like Ray Kurzweil that want to extrapolate those Moore's Law type curves into the indefinite future and show how we can live forever if you can live long enough. And so I'm like I'm skeptical of the religious versions of the afterlife. I'm pretty skeptical of all of these. I'm glad someone's working on the problem, but I don't think our generation anyway, or any generation soon, is going to live 200, 500,000 years, 10,000 years. I mean, these are the kinds of figures that these guys are talking about. I think it's delusional thinking. I think it's what I call afterlife for atheists. It's like, okay, we don't believe all that religious stuff, but we're going to live forever through science and technology. Yeah, okay, maybe. I hope so. I'm all for it. I hope you succeed. But so in the book, I really look at those claims very carefully and see what the evidence really shows when you take the emotional wish element out of it. And I'm sorry to say, it's not going to happen in our lifetime, if ever. And so I end the book with, after going through all of that, talking about how to find purpose and meaning in life if this is all there is. And it's really quite an optimistic book in that sense. Sounds pessimistic. I'm skeptical there's no afterlife. We're all going to die. That's it. But really, it's an optimistic book about why that makes this life so much more meaningful, purposeful, important, valuable, if this is all there is. And even if there is another afterlife after this one, still no one knows for sure. And shouldn't you make the most of this life in any case? Because this is it. This is what we have. We're here now. We're not in this other place, whether it exists or not. You're here now. So now's the time to be moral and good and live a deeply meaningful, purposeful life.
Well, I think that if for all the pessimism and skepticism, like you said, it has an elevating tone to it. And I like a few things about this book. It's even more, I think, than the other books that I've read of yours. You're really skilled, and you've honed that skill at what I think Eric Weinstein would call steel manning your opposition, that is giving a coherent and honest representation, religious or scientific or otherwise, of some of the best arguments against your thesis. And then you basically say, hey, I get where you're coming from, because it's tough, if not impossible, to think about what happens after death, and natural to want to create some kind of harmony and order. It's not just religion, like you said. There are fields of science that want to address these questions of immortality and utopia, which perhaps is a fool's gold errand, but we'll get into that. But once you've discarded the chaff, the ideas that don't quite stand the test of reason, you do have this elevating ending. So let me ask, is it a universal phenomenon that we are incapable of fully realizing our own mortality and to seek immortality?
Yes, it is. But let's back up for one second. What was that word you used? Steel manning?
Yes. Oh, I love that I can teach someone this word. I was telling my students about it. Yeah, Eric Weinstein. I don't think he invented it. In fact, I think he even gave credit to somebody else. I was listening to him talk with Sam Harris, and he was talking about, he has his a graphic that he's made for different kinds of arguments and where people stand. And he said that, one of the antidotes that he uses to engaging in arguments with people of all sorts of different worldviews is the opposite of straw manning, which he calls steel manning, laying out, not a new concept, but, laying out the opposition's complete argument, perhaps even better than they would, and before you start picking them. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I like that. That's pretty clever.
Yeah, me too.
Whoever came up with it, I like it. I might steal that, but try to find who to give credit to. Yes, well, you have to do that for sure. In fact, if anything, it helps hone your own thinking skills by being able to really deep dive into other people's arguments and see if you can articulate them as well as they could, or at least to the point where they would say, yes, that is what I'm arguing. And usually when you do that, they say, no, you've missed the point completely, and maybe you did. But maybe it is also when they hear the argument, they realize it doesn't sound so good. So they go, no, let me change that. Right. So I think in part some of that happens. But steel man, yeah, I like that. It's kind of really an very old idea in debates. You're supposed to be able to articulate your opponent's position clear enough that they say yes, and then you dismantle it. So. Anyway, I like that. Okay, what did you? The psychology of it. Yeah, so I start off the book actually talking about the fact that we can't even really conceive of what it means to be dead, because to conceive of anything, you have to be alive. You have to be conscious, and if you're dead, you're not. So it's actually impossible to conceive of nothing. And the analogy I use in the book is trying to picture what it's like. Well, first of all, I asked, picture yourself dead. What do you see? Yeah. When psychologists do this, people say, "Oh, I see my body in the casket, and my friends and family are there. Hopefully, they're mourning." And but of course, you wouldn't see anything. If you're in the casket, you're not perceiving anything. And it's a little bit like asking, picture picture nothing. There's no planets, no stars, no galaxies. There's not even space time. There's no light. There's nothing. And at some point, you can't actually picture that, because to picture something has to exist, and nothing is not a thing. I mean, this is a word we use to describe, and I can't even say it because to describe nothing, I'm just, it's like a word with a category. It's a thing that doesn't exist, and nothing is not even a thing that doesn't exist. It's just less than that. And as far as we know, that's what happens when you die. It's just like going under general anesthesia, 99, 98, 97, boom, boom, lights out. And that's all. And of course, you wake up and you're a little groggy and consciousness returns. I'm imagining that when you die, you just don't wake up. And so there's nothing to perceive. So that creates something of a paradox. We can't actually even know what it means to be dead. And yet we see it all around us. Every one of the 100 billion people that came before us has died and never come back, as far as we know. Now, I do deal in subsequent chapters with near-death experiences, reincarnation, anomalous experiences, in which people say, oh, yes, there's evidence people have died and gone to heaven or hell and come back. I show why most scientists don't accept that as evidence, and I don't either. But so that paradox then, I think, leads to the idea that, well, there just has to be something else, because I can't even imagine nothing. And this turns out to start really super early in life. If you ask children, like just age 3 or so, this alligator munches this little mouse, where's the mouse now? And, oh, the mouse is still hungry and misses its mommy. And, they tell these stories about, the mouse somehow continues, even though the mouse's body is munched and dead. And so Paul Bloom calls this our, natural born dualists. We just all are born with this sense that there's something else besides the material body and brain, that there's a mind, a soul, a something. Because that is intuitively what it feels like. I mean, it feels like there's thoughts in my head floating around, even though I know scientifically, they're neuron swapping chemicals and that's all. But it doesn't feel like that. And the same thing with my body. I feel like there's some other part of me that's floating around in there, such that I can say my arm, like there's a my that's separate from the arm, or my brain, that's separate from the brain. And everybody does that. And it's really hard to counter that intuition. And I think that's the deep motive behind most religious and spiritual, New Age, whatever ideas of consciousness continuing. So that's where I begin. That it's a deep problem in philosophy of just what is nothing, because that's really what we're talking about with death from a materialist perspective. And then how do you instantiate that into your life? What does that mean? So then I deal with the theory called terror management theory. I pretty much debunk this. The idea that all of civilization, everything humanity has done for 10,000 years, is driven by this terror of the awareness of our own mortality. And if chimps were aware they're going to die, maybe they'd build buildings and drive cars and create artwork and so on to reduce the anxiety associated with this terror. I don't think so. Anyway, so I spend quite a bit of time showing why I think that theory is wrong, and that the awareness of death does other things, but it's not the only or even most powerful human drive or motive.
Yeah, terror seems like it's a small part of a larger overall experience. Religion, then, seems like a very natural rejoinder to this problem, like a yearning for a more stable blueprint of, well, first of all, just the ability to be able to think, hey, there's a self in there steering the ship, but then building a blueprint of life after death. But religions, that they are inevitable, perhaps, doesn't make them correct, of course. I think you might say that the fact that something feels inevitable, something like religion, feels so natural, is the very reason to be skeptical of it. So maybe you could tell me about some of the standard religious theories that you talked about in the book.
Well, I ground through the monotheisms, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and what their versions are, and right there's quite a literature on the history of the idea of heaven, and the fact that heaven has a history is very telling in the sense that, and it's not a history like the history of cosmology or the history of science, where you read these works and you see this sort of unfolding drive toward models that better explain the actual physical world we know exists. The histories of heaven are not like that. They just sort of bounce around from one idea to another. There's no sense of progress. There's no we now know this idea about heaven was wrong because it was displaced by this other idea that was superior because it explained more of the data, etc. Nothing like that. It's just where you happen to have been born, what time of period of in history you happen to have been born, what culture you're in, and so on. It very much determines which version of heaven you like. So, although evangelical Christians are quite certain that if you don't accept Jesus, you are not going to heaven, Jews don't accept that. Muslims certainly don't accept Jesus as the Messiah. And so what does that mean? And, and I ask Christians this all the time, and they usually say something, oh, well, God has a special place for Jews because, they had it hard. No, I'm not talking about, what you think God thinks about Jews. I mean, why is your theory about the afterlife better than the Jewish notions, which the earliest Judaism ideas of the afterlife were really just nothing. It's what we were talking about. That when you die, just nothing happens. And then in subsequent centuries, they began to adopt components of the worldviews of the cultures they were in, of the Babylonians and Greeks and so on, and then constructed something of an afterlife, still different from Christians. But if you think about it, I ask Christians, so there's almost 2 billion Muslims who are just as certain as you are that you're going to hell because Jesus is not the Messiah and you picked the wrong religion. Of course, they say, well, yeah, but they're wrong. It's like, yeah, but when I talk to Muslims, they say, no, the Christians are wrong. So, if I talk to a Big Bang theorist and a steady state theorist, I can look and see which one has the better data to support their models of the origins of the universe. And the Big Bang theory won out. There's nothing like that in religion, where there's accumulation of experiments and data and evidence, and eventually one idea wins out over the other because it's better at explaining the evidence. But there's nothing like that here. So in any case, then I get into the problem of identity. Like, who are you in any case that you would be replicated? Now, this actually comes later in the book, but it has implications for religious notions of the afterlife. That is, when I'm talking later about the idea of copying your connectome, your complete set of memories, and then putting it into a computer, turning it on, and voila, there you are inside the computer looking out the little camera hole or something like Johnny Depp in Transcendent. The problem with this, in addition to the technological problems that I deal with, which are enormous, is that, well, what age are you when you're copied? Because there is no you, the snapshot of you when you're 29 or 39 or 69, they're all different. They're different yous. You have different memories from your 29th birthday or 5th birthday or whatever change over time. So which set of memories are you actually recording? Because none of them represent you. It's a fluid, constantly changing entity of self that doesn't really exist. The self is kind of an illusion in that sense, and so the singularity mind uploading people have this problem of identity that they haven't really addressed, in my opinion. But religion has the same problem, because like when you die and you wake up, next to Jesus or wherever you think you're going, well, what's waking up there? What's coming into being in heaven? Is it a physical body? If some Christian sects think it's a physical body. Okay, how old are you? 29, or some of them say 30 because Jesus was 30 or maybe 33 when he died. Whatever. Anyway, so around that age seems to be a good age. Yeah. Okay. So that means you have none of the memories you had from, say, age 30 to age 70 when you actually physically died. Where did those memories go? And, they're still in it. Well, no, they can't be, because you were resurrected when you were 30 or what. Okay, no, it's not a physical body. It's just a spiritual body. Okay, but again, which part of you is copied? All right, so the religion and science has the same problem of identity in terms of replicating or resurrecting you, either physically or spiritually. And anyway, I had some fun with this, like the Star Trek episode where Riker gets beamed up to an earlier spaceship. I forget, I think it was the Potemkin or something like that. But there's a split in these transporters. They never work quite right, and he got duplicated and left on the planet, and a copy went to the spaceship, and then 20 years later he's on the Enterprise with Picard, and they end up at this planet where they find the old Riker, and so Riker's staring at Riker. Who's the real Riker? Okay, this is again part of that problem of identity that I don't think religion solves.
Yeah, we get into like the meta before we solve some very much more basic problems. Like you're saying, it's like if there's a self, if there's a there, where is it? Maybe we could say that before we get into the more complex issue. Yes,
that's right. Who are you really? There's I mean, I do have a sense of self, like everybody does, but a lot of cognitive psychologists, like Paul Bloom, for example, thinks it's an illusion, in the sense that there's no place in your lifetime where you draw the line and go, there, that's the real me. There's no real you. You're constantly changing. I go through all this biology of it. Your cells all die and get replaced, most of them, and your whole body is recycled about every 7 years or so. So you're not the stuff you were, say a decade ago, with the exception of a few types of cells apparently that continue on. But so even the idea of I am defined by this mass inside my skin and head. Well, not really. The matter keeps changing. So it's not just the physical body. There's some pattern of information that represents you. But we know that pattern is constantly changing. Your memories are constantly edited and reformed. And I also deal with the problem of, so there's something called the memory self or mem self, that you yourself is defined by all your memories. But wait a minute. There's also the point of view self, the POV self, the you looking out through your eyes at the world, such that when you go to sleep tonight, you wake up tomorrow, there's a return of point of view. There's a continuity between your waking self, sleeping self, and waking self. Even though you're a little groggy for a few minutes, it comes back. The idea that we would copy all of those memories and put them in a computer and turn it on, that you would wake up inside the computer staring out through the little camera hole like you would waking up, I don't think so, because now, the way this is usually presented is we slice up your brain after you die and copy all the synapses and so on. This is an absurdly complex technological problem that we're not even remotely close to doing. But even if we did, let's say this was done instead of slicing up your brain when you're dead. We have say 100 years from now, a super sophisticated fMRI machine that scans your brain while you're alive in the tube there and copies every single synaptic connection and reconstitutes it either, in a 3D printer brain or inside a computer. It's just binary digits. And we turned it on and it was conscious and awake and standing there going, here I am. I'm Zach Rhoads, and then you, Zach Rhoads, climbing out of the MRI machine, would say, no, yeah. I'm right here. That's not me. That's a copy of me.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I work in the field of child development and then also the addiction field, and I think that if you were going to tell some of the people that I work with, clients, that you can do something as simple as copy a process as nuanced as development, considering all the things you go through, which is very much more realized by somebody going through something really rough, people will get pretty mad at you. It's a pretty simplistic concept.
Yeah, for sure. It's a really interesting problem. Now, the counter to this, I will tell you by the people that are into this, is that it's okay for there to be multiple yous. Each one of them thinks they're you. There could be 20 Zach Rhoads, and each of them thinks, well, I'm the real Zach Rhoads. But even that's a flawed argument, because it's just like twins. The moment you and the other 19 Zach Rhoads start running around the world and having different experiences, you start forming different memories. You go down different life paths, and all of a sudden your memory self is no longer identical. Now you're different people. And so, the problems are, just the philosophical problems are enormous, that I don't think the people that believe in this stuff have provided good answers.
Yeah, we're kind of creeping, not you, but the concepts creep into one another. We have religious theories of the afterlife that are so scattershot, and there's just no one universally recognized worldview among them, and they don't make progress. I think you just said they're culturally determined. But we think about science, like the methods and tools of science, we can gain purchase on truth claims. So a lot of the things you were just talking about are claims of being scientific. So that gets us into the really core of your book, which is that scientific search for the afterlife. And I think what you're talking about is some of the scientific searching for an afterlife. Should we be any more optimistic of any science in this field than religious one, or is the whole enterprise sort of a folie à deux?
Yeah. Well, for sure, that we're living in the best time in history ever in terms of health, longevity, being able to combat diseases, defeat diseases, and so on. We have a long ways to go for that, but there's never been a better time to be alive than today, in that sense. But the idea that, but even so, the idea that we're living twice as long as people did, 2 centuries ago. No, not really. What it really is more and more people are living longer and longer lives up to the upper ceiling of about 120 years. The number of centenarians has grown enormously. It's huge compared to centuries ago, but no one's making it past 120. So it's not like medicine has solved the problem at all. It's basically it solved all the problems that take you out early, to the point where you could live a long life. So, like, for example, to the radical life extensionists and the singularitarians and transhumanists and so on, who say to me, Shermer, don't you want to live to be 500,000 years old? It's like, well, yeah, but first just get me to 90, without cancer, and maybe get me to 100 without Alzheimer's and senility, and maybe 110, so in a way that I'm not just plugged into tubes and machines in a bed and I can't move, because that's not a life. Instead of aiming for these utopian type dreams, how about just solving specific problems? And that's what we've been doing so well. And so in that sense, we should all be grateful we get to live today, because we have a chance of living, a few more decades than our ancestors did. But still, no one's making it past 120. Now, I do deal with the people that say, well, we can do it. It's just an engineering problem. We're not there yet, but we'll get there. Moore's law, doubling of, power, of technology and science and knowledge, and we can do it. It's like, yeah, the problem is way harder than you think. And when you look at all the systems that fail at the same time, but by the time you hit your 80s or so, things start falling apart. 90s, they're really going fast. And we have nothing to slow that down. I mean, beyond the obvious stuff, don't smoke, moderate drinking, exercise every day, get plenty of sleep, just the obvious ones. But people are looking for something more, like, well, how about we reprogram the genome and fix the telomere problems at the end of a chromosome? Yes, that would be good. No one's done that yet, and not even close to doing it. I mean, there's like, the super breeding programs with fruit flies that live longer, or calorie restrictions on mice, and they live longer. Yes, but none of that's been done in humans yet. And in any case, if you look at the literature on calorie restrictions, the little waggish answer is, you call that living? Right. I mean, you're basically hungry all the time. And, so you get to live 10 years longer being hungry all the time. Well, that doesn't sound like a great solution to me. And in any case, it's looking more and more like that isn't the way to go. That is, all plant, vegetarian, vegan diet in which you have like 1,200 calories a day and you're always hungry. That doesn't even appear to be a healthy way to live. It appears eating meat and animal products, whole milk, these kinds of things turn out to be pretty good. Eggs, good. It's okay. And so the science there is super fluid. It's, always changing.
You talk about Aubrey de Grey, who I've been really fascinated by. I'm as skeptical as anybody, but I guess for people who don't know, he was somewhat of a maverick at some point who really is not so fringe in science anymore. And you quoted him as saying something like, "The first person to live to 1,000 is alive today." What do you? What's wrong with his whole thing?
Well, okay, and I know Aubrey. He's a pretty interesting guy. He's a lot of fun to be around. He's super bubbling over with enthusiasm and optimism, and we're going to make it. And to people like him, I say, go for it, man. I hope you do it. And I'll be right there with you when you have a proof of concept. It's the same thing I tell the cryonics people. You bring freeze a dog down to minus 265 degrees in a vat of liquid nitrogen for 6 months, and then bring him back, and he recognizes his name and so forth. Then I'll sign up. But until then, we're just not there. And Aubrey's science has been evaluated. His program has been evaluated by all the experts in aging research, and they say there's nothing there. He's done nothing. He's got the 7 steps. If we could solve these 7 problems, he solved none of the 7. and is not even close to solving any of the 7. And but yeah, I mean, I hope he does. In that way, if it helps cure cancer, Alzheimer's, things like this, I think it would be a boon for humanity. But let's not kid ourselves. When you talk to people like Aubrey or Ray Kurzweil, we're going to upload our minds and so on. I kind of feel like I'm in church again, like I'm listening to the preacher talking about how great it's going to be. It's like, wait a minute. This is sounding more and more like kind of New Age-ish woo-woo or religion.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand the impulse. Ray works at Google now. He's the chief engineer for all of Google. Oh my God, this guy has resources to do something about it. I hope he does it. I just don't think it's going to happen, and I think it's too much like religion to overcome all the obstacles and the lack of evidence.
Do you think there's anything to sort of an optimism bias that would work in our favor? I know that optimism bias has its definite downsides, especially, well, for reasons we could get into. You've written at length about it. But is there any sort of faith that allows us to get out of our analytic mind for long enough to take chances we might not otherwise, that you could see driving success in this area?
Yeah, I think there's a balance there. In the same way that I think entrepreneurs are notorious for their over-optimism bias. And in a way that's good, because more and more of them will succeed if they are kind of delusional. Most of them will fail because they're so delusional. But the ones that succeed, the Steve Jobs of the world, Jobs had that famous line about his, what was it, the reality... I forget what he had. He had a little phrase he used. Basically, he just denied reality. Said, "We're going to do this, and I don't care what the problems are." That works sometimes, but for most of us, I think that's too delusional. Entrepreneurs are high risk takers. So someone like a Ray Kurzweil, he's a genius. He's a great inventor. He's super creative, and if he can do it, great. But selling everyone on the idea that, don't worry about this life, we're going to live, forever, later. You're missing. I think you're missing something. I talk about that documentary film based on Kurzweil's life called Transcendent Man. It's a very moving documentary, very well done, and he is truly an inspirational, interesting guy. But it's a morose film. I mean, his life strikes me as kind of dark and obsessed with death, and it's like, dude, you're missing life now. This is it. Even if there is an afterlife somehow, religiously or scientifically, this is still it now, because this is the world we live in, not this other world. And I think that's too much optimism. I think a little pessimism is good because it keeps you focused on reality and what really counts now. And we don't want to be too pessimistic. So there's a balance there.
Yeah, it's a balancing act, and ironically, over-optimism gets you to the negative side of that balancing act at times. I think that Steve Jobs called it augmented reality.
Okay.
So it's like taking an advance on the truth, and then speaking it into existence, and then getting there. Speaking of augmented reality, I'd like to talk about a man who gave you a great review of the book, and I know you've become friends with. What do you think about the Deepak Chopra, like the "you are the universe" theory of, I don't know what you'd call it, immortality?
Yeah. Let's see. Here it is. Reality distortion field. That's Steve Jobs.
That is what it is. You're right. Reality distortion.
Yeah, the reality distortion field. Yeah. At the root of the reality distortion was Jobs' belief that the rules didn't apply to him. He had the sense that he was special, a chosen one, an enlightened one. Okay, maybe those are the people that changed the world. But he died of pancreatic cancer that he probably could have treated early enough, but he denied the reality of it and tried all these alternative cancer treatments. And there's good evidence that that's what he probably died early because of that, and that's the downside of the over-optimism bias.
Yeah, reality distortion. It sounds a lot like narcissism, doesn't it?
It is a little bit of that for sure. Yeah. Reality doesn't apply to me. Well, sorry. Yeah, it does. I mean, if it helps you get through the day, fine. Whatever it takes to help you get through the night. But it's better to live in the real world, I think. Anyway, I'm sorry. You asked me something else, and I forgot what that was now.
I was asking what you think about the, and I know you've spent a lot of time thinking about it, the Deepak Chopra, that you are the universe kind of
yes, okay.
idea.
So, yeah, I devoted a chapter to Deepak because I went and visited his center, the Chopra Center in Carlsbad, California. It's a beautiful place right near the beach. It's on this resort, it's Four Seasons Resort, and I tried the meditation and the yoga and the tea and chanting, all that stuff, and it was great. So it's not like I fully immersed into meditation. I've tried meditation many times. I just can't get dialed into it. It's just not my thing. But I can see how it works and why it works. But Deepak, of course, wants to go deeper than that. His idea is that that consciousness is the ground of being, is the way he puts it. It's the ontological primitive, he says. I know. So what he means is that this physical world, all of it, including you and I, is something of an illusion, or it's a instantiation of consciousness into physical reality temporarily, and then so his answer to where do you go when you die is you would just return to where you were before you were born. Because that's one of my favorite little thought experiments. People say, where do you think we go when we die, Shermer? I say, same place you were before you were born. It's like, what? But I didn't exist before I was born. Right. Oh, no, you're not. Oh, you are saying that. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Well, for Deepak, there is no birth or death. There's no time. There's no beginning or end. Consciousness is just everything. Now, he had some interesting arguments about this. I mean, you can kind of delve into the literature of consciousness studies, and it's not long before you hit the wall of a good explanation for consciousness. David Chalmers famously called it the hard problem, or the other, thought experiment of, what it's like to be a bat. You can't know what it's like to be a bat. And if you did, you'd just be a bat. You wouldn't be wondering what it's like to be a bat. Right. Maybe you were a bat wondering what it's like to be a human. And anyway, so you hit this problem that we can't seem to get past, and it's still not solved. And so Deepak's answer is the answer isn't in a material explanation found in neurons and neurotransmitter substances and things like that. It's found through this kind of personal dive into your own consciousness. And anyway, so I devote a long chapter on that and what I think is wrong with it. Although I can't say I know for sure he's wrong, because who knows? If he's right and I die, and I'm not going to wake up in some physical beat, but there's just something else and my consciousness goes on in some other state. Okay, fine. Wherever I am, if Deepak's there, I'll retract my skepticism.
Yeah. And he'll have to accept
my Christian friends. If my Christian friends are right, or my Jewish friends, or Muslim friends, mm-hmm. I'm happy to say I'm wrong, but I have no idea how that would happen. Of course, they don't think I'm going to make it, but again, I can't imagine a good and loving, all-powerful, all-knowing God who would punish people for such a human-like issue of belief. And jealousy, and I'm angry at you for not believing him. These are all such human things that if there's a God, there's no way such a being could be bogged down with such human-like emotions and problems. So I'm really not worried about it. I don't think about it. I'm not terrorized by death. I don't think about it a lot. Maybe a little more. People ask me, why are you writing this book now? It's like, because I'm in my 60s. I'm cramming for the final. Really, I don't. I'm just, by temperament, I'm a fairly optimistic person, and I don't really think about these bad things. And I know some people do think about it, but I think most people are not terrorized by death. I think it's, when you ask people why they believe in God, for example, the idea of I'm afraid of dying, or I want to go to heaven, is pretty low on the list. There's a bunch of other things that come way before that. So I don't think it's a huge issue for most people. A bigger issue is when someone they love dies, someone else dies. That has a far more traumatic effect on people's lives.
At the top of the interview, I lauded you for what I call steelmanning your opposition. So among all of these theories of which you're skeptical, which, I suppose it wouldn't be a religious one, but which scientific bid then for discovering immortality, etc., do you find the most compelling and the most plausible, and why should we still be skeptical of it?
Well, I would bank on the radical life extensionists in the sense of starting with living a pretty healthy life, which, some things we know make a difference: exercise, good diet, healthy food, don't smoke, moderate alcohol, don't drive your Tesla at 150 miles an hour, don't do crazy, risky things like that. Beyond that, most of the stuff I've read, all the things, diet and, crazy things you could do. There's no evidence any of this stuff will get you past 120. The best thing would be, I think, maybe in our lifetime is some of these genetic, like the CRISPR thing. If there's a way to tweak the genome, fix the telomere problem. The telomere problem is that cells, so-called Hayflick number, the limit on the number of times a cell can divide. And if a cell divides indefinitely, it's called cancer. So, you got to solve this problem without just turning people into blobs of cancer. And this turns out to be a much harder problem. But still, I'm impressed by how rapidly genetics has developed in just the last decade or so. But at 63, for me, and Kurzweil is a decade older than me. He puts it at 2040. If you can make it to 2040, you get to live forever. I don't think that's not that long. That's not very far away now. And he used to say 2030. I notice he's pushing it back a little further. That's going to put him into the 90s and me into the late 80s. I just don't. So cryonics. Okay, now it's not going to succeed yet, but if they could get to the point where you could do to a brain what cryobiologists can today do with an embryo. So an embryo is a living creature. It's a thing. It's alive, and they freeze it indefinitely. There's banks that hold it for you until you need it for IVF. And okay, but a brain is just many orders of magnitude more complex and big than an embryo. And so the problem with injecting the body with this antifreeze chemical they use is that it can't infuse into the brain fast enough before the cells die, before damage is done. So it's not just the freezing process, because they have a new technology now where it's called vitrification, where they sort of turn your brain into a blob of this sort of plastic gel-like substance, and then freeze it. And then when you defreeze it, you defrost it, hopefully it'll defrost without the cells bursting from the ice crystals. So far, they can't do this.
What could go wrong?
In my opinion, everyone frozen to date is dead, and that's how the state treats it. It's a form of burial, legally. And besides that, but by the way, you are frozen on the worst day of your life, the day you died. So this is not a good place to start.
Yeah, you don't want to be the one in the room waking up when you
wake up. But in terms of the identity problem, that's the one I think would be closest to you going under general anesthesia and waking up 3 hours later. But with cryonics, you'd wake up 1,000 years later or whatever. I'm not at all sure this would happen. Again, proof of concept with a dog would be nice. I'll change my mind if I see that, but they haven't done that yet. And as far as I know, they're not close to doing that yet. So anyway, again, I'm not hopeful for any of these, frankly, honestly. If anything, all the more reason why every single day counts and it's special and it matters, just in case. If I'm wrong and we get to live forever in some other place or whatever, okay, fine. But for today and tomorrow, just assume this is it.
So let's talk about that. If you can't live forever, then why not just create I couldn't get the thing out without laughing. A perfect world here on Earth, a heaven on Earth, or a utopia.
Yeah, so the two chapters in the middle of the book deal with that, because that is a related drive. The idea of, well, we can engineer societies to be perfect so that we have infinite happiness now. Yes, okay, this sounds like a laudable goal. First of all, every one of them has failed, and anything from these relatively harmless communes and societies and little groups in the 19th century where they had a lot of sex, but no one was murdered, to, the Heaven's Gate and Jonestown and these kinds of religious or secular cults that end up in people killing themselves. Those do a moderate amount of damage to the, macro scale socialist communist experiments that killed upwards of, 50 to 100 million people. They fail for a reason. And the reason is this human nature is and human desires are so diverse that there is no answer to what's the best way to structure society. There's multiple peaks on the moral landscape, as Sam Harris says, and there's a lot of them. It's restricted by our human nature, but there's no one that's going to work, and that's one problem they have with it. And then I also deal with the sort of pessimism bias. There's the optimism bias and the pessimism. So on the one hand, there's the idea that things are terrible now, but they used to be great in the golden age, the good old days. So we just have to get back to the good old days, whenever that is. 1950s? No, that was not the 18th century, the 15th century, the Renaissance, the Greeks. No, and no. You would not want to live in any of those times, if nothing else for the dentistry. And so I really show why all those fail, and why the idea of protopia, which I talked about at the end of the moral arc, which is Kevin Kelly's idea of just incremental small steps of progress every day, where every day is slightly better than the day before, but not in huge leaps, not utopian. So protopia, let's just work to make the society we have a little bit better. By tweaking the system a little bit better. And we do that already. So let's just keep doing more of that. And let's apply the methods of science, social science in particular, but economics, political science, and so on, to figuring out what we've been doing right and do more of that, and figure out what we've been doing wrong and do less of that. And that is what we have been doing. It's not sexy. It's not utopian. It doesn't sound like a grand civilizational experiment. But it works. It works. 3 steps forward, 2 back. Yes, there's lots of examples of things not going well, but so yeah, that's my thoughts on that.
Yeah, for people who aren't familiar with that argument, and maybe Steven Pinker did it the best in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature. Just before we go on, I just want to flag that so that people know what we're talking about. Things are getting better, even though it might not seem. And I suppose part of the reason is that press likes to dive into and linger on the most terrifying aspects of the world, and we get more of it than ever. So we have this idea that horrible things are happening more than ever, but really, just about every metric, well-being is flourishing now, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, Steve's Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature. But I also want to recommend that your listeners, after they purchase Heavens on Earth, place a pre-order for Pinker's next book, which comes out a couple weeks after mine. Actually comes out February 27th. It's called Enlightenment Now. And it's the case for science, reason, humanism, and progress in humanism. And he piles the data up that's from many sources that in every aspect of life is better than it's ever been. I mean, you really can't. It's almost impossible to find any area that's not better than it used to be. You can find pockets in certain countries in Africa that still have poverty and warlords and and dictatorships and things like that. Yes, but there's far fewer of those than there's ever been, and it continues to go that way. And I think the optimists here have it over the pessimists in terms of data. And that's the good thing about Steve's work is I don't call him an optimist. I call him a realist. He's got the data. And he would be willing to say, as I would, if you show me data that crime is going up, I'll say, okay, we have a problem. Things are getting worse in this one particular area. And that does happen. Like there was an uptick in inner city homicides in 2015 in areas like Chicago, even though New York City actually just posted the lowest crime rate it's ever had since the 1960s. So, even there, those pockets are just anomalies in the overall long-term trend of things getting better. So, there I think there's reason for hope, or as I say, reason and science for hope, in my review of Pinker's book. And it's not a blind, optimistic utopian kind of thing. It's that. It's a scientific attempt to tease apart the causal variables that are having positive effects on society. So, for example, smart policing. We now know that like 90%. It's like a power law thing. 80% of crimes happen in 20% of areas. So we know that street corner at Sepulveda and 15th Street is where gangs hang out. All right, so we're going to go park a squad car there and have police just walking around. Boom, the crime all of a sudden goes down. Okay, so it's not some utopian fix it all. We're going to throw more money at poverty, and that's going to do it. It's very, very specific things we have to do, and that we've been getting better at. So that in that sense, I'm realistically optimistic.
Lawrence Krauss was on the show when he published his book, The Greatest Story Ever Told So Far. And we got to a point in the conversation, I can't remember why, but I asked him to list some of the basic joys of living, and he listed some things similar to what you said. I paraphrase, but among his list was, I have the gift of reason. I have the ability to participate in life here on Earth and acknowledge my intuitions, but force my beliefs to conform to reality. And I'm on this random place in the middle of nowhere in this unimpressive time in history of the universe, and somehow I've developed a consciousness that allows me to appreciate all those things. So when he said that to me, I had to pause and think, wow, among all my fears and my pessimism, as you say, he just gave a long list of comforts, and that's probably just the beginning. So what's up with me, and I guess all human beings, that even with all of the wonder and joy that we experience, especially as life gets more pleasant over time, that we're not satisfied. We continue our drive and looking for things like you write about in the book, Immortality.
Yeah, and I just called up here on the internet here. The most poetic statement of this is by Richard Dawkins in his book Unweaving the Rainbow. This is the opening line: "We are going to die, and that makes us the lucky ones." Most people are never going to die because they're never going to be born. The potential people who could have been here in my place, but who will in fact never see the light of day, outnumber the sand grains of Arabia. Certainly those unborn ghosts include greater poets than Keats, scientists greater than Newton. We know this because the set of possible people allowed by our DNA so massively exceeds the set of actual people. In the teeth of these stupefying odds, it is you and I, in our ordinariness, that are here. We privileged few who won the lottery of birth against all odds. How dare we whine at our inevitable return to that prior state from which the vast majority have never stirred? Isn't that beautiful?
Yeah,
Richard is such a good writer. People say, how come he's so famous? How come it's always Richard Dawkins that's quoted? Because he's really good.
Yeah, he is. I remember reading that too. Where did that come from? Was that an essay?
That was Unweaving the Rainbow. I think it was a collection of essays that he had published elsewhere. No, I think it might have been an original book. Anyway, it's a short book, but yeah, I think that really captures it poetically. And Pinker actually ends that way. I don't have the copy of Enlightenment now here in front of me, but he ends in kind of a beautiful, lyrical, rhetorical flourish at the end of his book too, as I try to at the end of The Moral Arc. I mean, gratitude is what we should feel. You don't have to feel lucky or chosen or anything like. Just be grateful, that we have what we have. And 1,000 years from now, maybe it'll be just so much better that you and I could not even conceive of how great it's going to be. I mean, that's what Kurzweil thinks. He said we can't even conceive of how great it's going to be. You have basically an onboard computer. You have Wikipedia in your brain. Yeah. And okay, that would be great. Maybe that's great. But let's just be grateful what we have now.
Yeah, if this is all there is, where do we find meaning in life besides? I guess you gave a good description with the Dawkins quote, and maybe it's gratitude is where we find meaning in our life. Is that what we're left with?
Yeah, that's it. So I end the book talking about there's all this huge body of literature in psychology now on happiness, positive psychology, and it turns out that that's something of a red herring, because it's not just happiness that people want in terms of like pleasure. Like, right. just plug yourself into a morphine drip or get yourself hooked on oxycodone or hydrocodone or one of those, and life will be great. No, that actually makes life worse. And just seeking to do things purely for pleasure is not enough. What people really want is meaning. So I discuss at length a long research paper by Roy Baumeister. He's a social psychologist, on the difference between happiness and meaning, the purposefulness. And so, like, for example, you go out for drinks and dinner with friends. That's fun. It's very pleasurable, but it's very short-lived. By contrast, if you say become a caretaker for your parents, one of your parents, I've done this. It is not fun at all. It's exhausting. It's emotionally shattering. It's depressing to go to these hospitals and hospices and nursing homes, and oh God, it was terrible. But I felt purposeful doing it. Like this makes me feel good about myself. I'm doing something to help somebody else. My parents who gave me this life, and I have a way to kind of return the favor by helping them. It's not fun, but it's meaningful, purposeful. Anyway, so the huge body of literature on this shows that is the case what most people want, not just happiness, but purpose and meaning, and that often requires doing something unpleasant. Working out is mostly not fun. It's mostly unpleasant, and that's what makes it fulfilling, because it makes you a stronger person. You feel better later, and so on. Most of life is like that. Raising children is exhausting, but it's deeply meaningful. It doesn't bring you happiness in the pleasure sense of the morphine trip, but it does something even deeper and better. So that's where I end, is talking about what are the things we can do that bring deeper purpose and meaning. So, and I'll leave that for readers to find out.
Great. Michael Shermer, thank you so much again I know you must be super busy right now, so thank you so much for coming on the show. The book's called Heavens on Earth, The Scientific Search for the Afterlife, Immortality, and Utopia. And where should I direct my listeners to find out? Well, first to find your book, buy your book, and find out more about you and your work.
Well, as Hitchens always said, find bookstores everywhere, carry my books. But of course, Amazon is the obvious place you can get it cheaper than bookstores. But michaelshermer.com or skeptic.com are the two portals that lead to my work and what I do. So that's the easiest way to find me.
Well, thank you so much again. I enjoyed reading the book, and I encourage everybody to go out and get it, if for nothing else, a reboot of our religious and immortal firmware.
That's right. Yeah, I like that. All right, thanks, Zach.
Yeah,
appreciate that.
Thank you once again. Take care.
This world, this crazy world I know, it turns, and long night's over, and the sun's coming up. Everything's right, so just hold tight. Everything's right, so just hold tight. Everything's